Right, I think we ought to get started. I just want to start by saying thank you and welcome to this webinar that's going to shine a light on the human cost of deforestation and the companies that are ignoring the risk. I'm Darren McKenzie. I work for Global Canopy. I'll be attempting to steer you through the next hour. A month ago, we held an event at London Climate Action Week with the Brazilian indigenous leader, Chai Suri. And one of the things that she said at that event is the quotation that you might have read on the registration page of this webinar. And she said, "I am afraid because my mother, my father, my husband, and my whole community are receiving death threats for defending the forests like me." She also said, deforestation isn't just about trees. Deforestation is ending lives. And that's a terrifying summation of what indigenous people face for essentially just living in their own homes. So this webinar is going to look at the links between human rights abuses and the underlying causes of those abuses. So the agricultural supply chains in mining, and the role of companies and governments in this issue. And we're holding this webinar as Global Canopy publishes a briefing looking at how the most influential companies in forest risk supply chains perform on human rights. Today, I'm delighted to say that we're going to be joined by we are joined by three experts. Valéria Araújo, who is from Brazil's Human Rights Fund, Louise Eldridge, who is the lead policy advisor at CAFOD, and Emma Thomson, who is Global Canopy's Forest 500 manager. There will be time for questions. We value diverse views, opinions, backgrounds, and experiences, because ultimately what we want is an open and an honest dialogue. So for comments and questions, just use the Q&A function on Zoom. The webinar is also being translated into Portuguese, so you are able to choose which language you prefer to listen to. I just want to start, I suppose, by putting this into some kind of context. Greenpeace released a statistic last week collected from satellite data that said the first half of 2022 had the highest rate of deforestation ever recorded in the Amazon. An area 5 times the size of New York City has been deforested from there between January to June this year. And that's not just shocking because of the scale of the destruction. It's shocking because just 9 months ago in Glasgow, 141 world leaders promised to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. And the Brazilian government was one of the signatories. And yet, rather than getting any better, on the ground, things are getting worse. So in 2021, the Amazon forest lost 18 trees per second. And of course, this isn't just a problem for the Amazon. Globally, 3.75 million hectares of tropical primary rainforests were lost. And this destruction is driven by global trades in forest commodities, beef products, soy, palm oil, timber, minerals. Forests are being turned into land for agriculture and they're being ripped apart for mining. So it makes sense to start with Valéria Araújo from the Brazil Human Rights Fund. Anna, thank you very much for being here. Can you, I suppose, start by giving us a sense of the current situation in Brazil?
Darren, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank Global Canopy for this invitation. Well, first of all, I guess, I'm a Brazilian lawyer, currently serving as executive director of the Brazil Human Rights Fund, which is a private foundation that funds human rights in Brazil by supporting grassroots organizations in their fights for rights. And I guess it's interesting to say that I began my career as a lawyer for indigenous peoples. And back then, one of the biggest challenges that I faced at that time was trying to demonstrate to a society that was starting to worry about environmental issues that we can't protect the environment without fighting to guarantee the rights of indigenous peoples, quilombolas, and other traditional populations that live in the forest. So it's really interesting to be here and talk about the relationship of human rights and deforestation for me. To talk about the situation in Brazil, let's just go back in history a little bit and say, that the relationship of Brazil with our forests has always been one of conflict. The Portuguese, when colonizing the country, used to call the Amazonia the Green Devil. In the 70s, during the military dictatorship, the government saw the forest and the people who lived in the forest as obstacles to development, stating that we needed to cut the forest and populate the area with cattle in order to become a world power nation. It's only in the 90s that activists were actually able to show that defending indigenous rights, especially concerning their traditional lands, was not only in the interest of human rights, but also in the interest of those who fought for the protection of the environment. As we were able to finally see that by guaranteeing the right to territories and culture of our traditional people, we were also guaranteeing the sustainability of the forest. The problem is that with the election of Bolsonaro, it seems that we are back to the 70s in Brazil. To our president, indigenous peoples, traditional population, activists, and the forest itself are all problems, literally speaking, obstacles to be removed, as he says. He was elected under the promise to not demarcate any more indigenous or quilombo lands and has kept his promise so far. Deforestation rates, we heard here Darren saying, have skyrocketed every year of the Bolsonaro government. In 2021, the Amazon rainforest had its worst year in a decade, with an area of more than 10,000 kilometers deforested, which is equivalent to a third of the area of Belgium. It's a deforestation rate 29% higher than the previous year, 2020. These all-time heights are followed by unprecedented numbers of invasions of indigenous lands, illegal exploitation of natural resources, and violence. Invasions of indigenous lands increased by 137% in 2019 and 2020. The number of indigenous leaders murdered rose by 61% in that same period. What we heard Tishai Surui saying, it's not, a mere threat, it's a real threat. Just yesterday, it was reported by the NGO Repórter Brasil that 4 big tech companies, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, have been using in their components gold that was illegally smuggled from the Kayapó land in the Xingu area. The Yanomami people, who are well known and have also for long struggled against the invasion of their lands by gold miners, have seen in the last year an escalation of the conflict in their territory with massive invasion and violent acts such as torching of an entire village and the death of 2 children by mining equipment, which I believe the entire world heard about. As we speak of violence resulting from land dispute, it's important to state that Brazil is the 4th country in the world in regards to assassination of activists linked to environmental cause. In 2020, 20 people were murdered in the country for defending their territories and social environmental rights, according to Global Witness. Right now, the country is still reeling from the tragic deaths of Bruno Pereira and the British journalist Don Phillips, who were also defending indigenous territories and environmental rights. Around the Anapu region that became famous for the murder of Sister Dorothy in 2005, an environmental activist, rural workers who have continued her fight for land reform and sustainable agriculture still live under constant threat. And in the beginning of this year, were terrorized by local farmers who set fire to their homes and issued death threats against community leaders. This scenario of death and destruction takes a toll on the whole country. From an environmental perspective, deforestation has already caused climate chaos in Brazil. 2022 saw severe storms, northeast and southeast part of the country, causing horrible floods, led to the hundreds of deaths and thousands of homeless people. And at the same time, in other parts of the country, we have struggled with a major drought, severely affecting agricultural production. But the fact is that deforestation serves a historic project of land occupation dictated by powerful economic interests that seek to free land for exploitation. The objective is actually force people to leave the forest. And we are already seeing some migration to larger cities in the Amazon region, where people were facing horrible conditions regarding to housing, sanitation, healthcare, while also seeing a rise in violence in those cities and a rising incarceration rate in a country that already figures as the third highest in terms of prison population. Those who make into the cities face other hardships such as unemployment or precarious labor conditions. As we speak of human rights, it's important to have in mind that Brazil is a society marked by structural racism and gender inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic has deepened our inequalities when it comes to race, gender, and class. A report by OECD found that the risk of mortality from COVID-19 was 1.5 times higher for the Black population, despite a higher incident rate of the disease in the white population. Black people hospitalized with COVID-19 had a 1.3-fold to 1.5-fold increased mortality risk compared to white Brazilians. Black women lost their job the most in the pandemic, and the number of Black unemployed women has jumped from 4.4 million in 2019 to 7.3 million in 2021. As a result of the pandemic and the prolonged economic crisis, hunger is also hitting Brazil very hard right now. Last week, a survey showed that 33 million Brazilians are going hungry. This means approximately 1 in 7 inhabitants of the country. But it's also worth noting that hunger in Brazil is determined by race and gender. More than 60% of food insecure households are headed by women and or Black people. Vulnerable communities are those who suffer the most with the increasing violence, including violence by the states. And I'm not only talking about the forest. Last week, at least 19 people were killed in a police operation in Complexo do Alemão, one of the largest favela in Rio de Janeiro, just by being Black and poor. So these are some of the most recent examples of the savageries committed in Brazil against human rights. The lives of human rights defenders, indigenous peoples, Black and poor people are daily attacked, often openly and directly. In Brazil, not only the state is failing to guarantee human and environmental rights, but those who dare to try to do so and go against interests, usually of large corporations, put their lives at risk. Thank you.
Anna, thank you very much for that. Let's move on to Louise Eldridge from CAFOD, who is very much going to build on that message from Anna about the human cost of deforestation. It's not just about trees.
Thanks, Darren. So hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Louise. I'm the lead policy advisor on the private sector at CAFOD. So next slide, please. CAFOD is the official Catholic aid agency in England and Wales. We work on long-term development, responding to emergencies and campaigning to challenge the structures that drive poverty, inequality and environmental harm. And we believe strongly in the inseparability of human rights and the environment. So we very much take an integral ecology approach, which is based on Catholic theology. So understanding that everything is connected. So this will really drive a lot of what I'm talking about today. So next slide, please. So I've just put on this slide a few quotes that illustrate what we mean by this. So these are some of the partners that CAFOD works with around the world. We work in over 30 different countries. I will primarily talk about Brazil today, but the issue of deforestation and the kind of associated risks for human rights are also issues in many other countries around the world, including Peru, Colombia, and other countries of the Amazon and also the DRC as well, where CAFOD works, where communities and the environment affected by global business operations that are driving deforestation. So many of our partners are impacted by the destruction and degradation of forests and other ecosystems for the production of goods sold and used by UK companies. So today I'm going to be mainly talking about mining and gold in particular. We know this is an issue for many other commodities as well. So next slide, please. So I'm shortly going to show a short video from Mauricio, who's an activist that CAFOD works with, who recently visited us in the UK. And Mauricio is treasurer of the Hutakara Yanomami Association and works closely with the president, Davi Yanomami, on the struggle for Indigenous people's rights. And he's worked for many years alongside the federal police in Brazil to remove illegal invaders from Yanomami territory. So the video was put together for World Environment Day when Mauricio was here with us. So that's why there's a description in the first section. So if we can go to the next slide and play the video.
Meu nome é Maurício Iequana, diretor da Hutakara Associação Yanomami. Trabalho na defesa do povo Yanomami e Iequana do Brasil, do estado de Roraima. A situação atual hoje da terra indígena Yanomami é uma situação que agrava cada vez mais sobre a invasão ilegal de garimpeiros. Então, a Hutakara Associação Yanomami trabalha recebendo informações, recebendo denúncias concretas que está vindo da comunidade e a gente elabora um documento para denunciar esses fatos que estão acontecendo. A nossa luta é defender o nosso território para que nosso povo, nossas pessoas vivam bem. Hoje, o presidente, nenhum representante do governo não pode falar mais em nome dos povos indígenas. É nós que temos que assumir esse espaço e falar para os líderes mundiais que existimos, que nós somos os defensores. Nós somos uma nação que defende mudança do clima, a questão de manter a floresta em pé.
Thank you. So next slide, please. So the Yanomami and Yekana people depend on and protect an area of tropical forest twice the size of Switzerland, about 9.6 hectares in the Brazilian Amazon. And deforestation in the Amazon is an attack on nature, it's an attack on biodiversity, the climate, but it's also an attack on these communities and their culture and way of life as well. So you can see on the map there the locations of these indigenous groups and the kind of widespread area that they cover. So next slide, please. So I'm now going to talk a bit about the impact of mining on these communities caused by approximately 20,000 illegal gold miners operating in this territory. This mining is now reaching catastrophic levels. There was first an invasion of gold miners in the 1980s, and this has increased. And we've heard already about the situation in Brazil at the moment, how deforestation has massively worsened in recent years. The gold trade, previously an artisan trade, has become a highly sophisticated global operation and is also driving the destruction of the Amazon. So it's partly driven by the high value of gold on the global market, with gold hitting its highest ever value in March 2022. Gold is laundered in Brazil, which allows it to be exported to other countries. And it's often purported to be legal, but the supply chain is notoriously opaque. And this gold is ending up in many different markets around the world, as I'll later talk about. And illegal gold mining is now at its worst since the Yanomami Indigenous Territory was demarcated and ratified 30 years ago. And it's on a massive scale. Operations take place across many locations, deep in supply chains. It's quite difficult for the federal police to carry out operations to tackle this. So just recently, net emissions from the Brazilian Amazon exceeded those of Argentina or Pakistan, although the full Amazon, including parts of the forest in neighboring countries, remained a net carbon sink. You can see from some of these statistics here on the slide that the situation is getting a lot worse, and this is partly due to the so-called death projects or package of destruction that's been pushed by the Brazilian government in the National Congress. And there's a strong pressure by agribusiness and mining lobbies to fast track this approval of these laws before the general elections. There've been lots of campaigning against this in the recent year. And one of the most harmful bills is PL 191/2020, which would legalize mining and other large-scale infrastructure projects in indigenous lands. And this is, as my understanding, which I hope is up to date, sort of been back and forth, but it hasn't quite passed through yet. But it's very much, this is very much a live issue. And as I said, there's a kind of rush to try and get this passed through before the elections, which are happening later this year. So I've just got some images on the next slides, which show the kind of extent of destruction. So if we can just sort of move slowly through these, just to illustrate the kind of scale of what's happening and the impacts that this is having, not only on the forest, but also the communities that are living there. So gold mining is causing systemic human rights violations and environmental damage. It's causing mass forced displacement, increase in violence. It's exacerbating the existing healthcare crisis, collapse of the health system. Water is contaminated by mercury from mining as well. And there are other conflicts, social conflicts and other issues that are linked to this. So the impacts are very much, as I said, kind of been, interrelated. That we've got the deforestation impacts on the climate, but we've also got these people that have lived here in the forest and helped to protect it for generations, who are having their lives and communities destroyed as well. So if we can go on to the next slide. I've just been told to slow down a little bit for the interpreter, so apologies for talking a little fast. So this is a quote from Mauricio, who we heard from earlier. Mauricio emphasizes that the drivers of deforestation and attacks on his community have come not only within the country, but outside as well, from international markets that are driving the gold trade. And Mauricio has been through a lot of trauma. As he says here, gold miners killed his uncle. He's faced serious harassment and death threats as well. And many other human rights defenders working on this issue have also faced this. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to finish up by talking about the UK's role. So the UK has a very important role as a financial centre of the international mining industry. It's estimated that around 30% and possibly more of gold exported from Brazil is illegal. The UK is a top 3 importer of gold from Brazil as well. The supply chain, as I mentioned earlier, is very opaque. It's very difficult to trace the gold, but it's almost certain that illegal Amazon gold is being imported by the UK, is being traded in the UK. So various reports have concluded that countries that buy gold from Brazil, such as Canada, Switzerland, and the UK, are exposed to this risk. Recently, a Swiss NGO found that 5 tons of gold had been imported into Switzerland from the Amazon in 2020 and 2021. And the main Swiss refiners issued a statement subsequently committing not to deal with gold from Indigenous territories in the future. As I said, it's really difficult often to trace how this gold is coming onto these markets and where it's how it's traveling, and it's often purported as legal when it is in fact not. So just last week, a Canadian mineral exploration company secured a massive financing package for the development and construction of a gold project in Pará State, Brazil. It's very much a live issue still. And I'll just finish up there, and I'll say that we think the burden should not be on communities to prove that abuse is linked to international companies. Instead, we need the burden to be on international companies and financiers to make sure that this is not happening in their supply chains. I'll talk about that in the kind of solution section later on. Thank you very much.
Louise, thank you very, very much for that. Emma Thomson is our Forest 500 manager at Global Canopy. In a sense, it's your job to fill in the gaps a little bit. I mean, we've got a real sense of what is happening on the ground, but we know this is all connected to our global system of trade and finance. So talk to us about corporate action, or perhaps the lack of corporate action.
Thanks, Aaron. Yes, absolutely. So Forest 500 does publish all of the data that we collect online, but today I am just going to talk through some of the findings of our latest briefing, which, as Darren mentioned, has launched today, which looks at the companies that are ignoring the human cost of deforestation. Next slide, please. Forest 500 started in 2014 to hold companies and financial institutions accountable to their voluntary deforestation commitments, as well as the associated human rights abuses, specifically looking at agricultural commodity-driven deforestation, so commodities like soy and beef and palm oil. It was around that time in 2014 that a lot of organizations were signing up to collective agreements to tackle deforestation. And Forest 500 is holding those companies and financial institutions accountable. We identify and rank the most important players in supply chains linked to tropical deforestation. That is 350 companies at all stages of the supply chain, so from producers through to retailers. And then also 150 financial institutions that are providing the most finance to those companies. Next slide, please. We assess all 350 companies and financial institutions on the strength and implementation of their commitments on deforestation and associated human rights abuses. We do those assessments annually, and for each of the highest forest risk commodities that those companies are exposed to through their supply chains. So we focus on soy, beef, leather, timber, pulp and paper, and palm oil, as collectively those commodities drive over 2/3 of tropical deforestation at the moment. As you can see on the screen, our methodology has 4 key sections. The one that I am going to focus on today is associated human rights, which assesses on whether the company has policies in place to address critical human rights issues in forest risk supply chains. But as you can see, we do also look for the overall approach to deforestation, the strength of their policies on deforestation, and also how they're implementing their commitments on human rights and deforestation, and whether they're being transparent about that implementation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So today we are looking at the performance of those 350 companies with the most influence on tropical deforestation and what they're doing to address and eliminate the human rights abuses associated with that deforestation from their supply chains. As you can see on the screen, our latest assessments, which were completed in 2021, assessed companies on 6 key criteria linked to human rights. There was labor rights. So did they have a commitment to protect the labor rights of workers in their supply chains? Do they have an active commitment to include smallholders in their supply chains? Do they have a commitment to address gender discrimination and inequality? Do they commit to remediate any social or environmental harms linked to deforestation? Did they commit to ensure the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities? And finally, do they have a commitment to address land conflict in their supply chains? As you can see, performance across the board was poor, and more than a third of the companies assessed, of those 350, hadn't made a single commitment on human rights for any of the commodities that they were assessed for. Next slide, please. Thank you. I just want to start by focusing in on one particular finding for a moment, especially in the context of what Anna and Louise have been talking about, which is that 93% of the companies with the most exposure to tropical deforestation risk through their supply chains haven't set a single commitment to refrain from land acquisition or development until any existing land conflicts have been resolved in their operations or supply chains. Next slide, please. Thank you. With so many of the companies with the greatest influence on forestry supply chains failing to set that policy on land use, global commodity sourcing continues to risk being linked to land use conflicts, and that needs to change. And to contextualize that stat even further, we can look at corporate commitments on free, prior, and informed consent, as you can see on the screen. So here we can see the proportion of upstream companies. So they are the companies that produce and process the forest risk commodities. So for instance, the companies that grow the palm oil or the palm and then turn that into palm oil would be the processors. And looking at the proportion with free, prior, and informed consent commitments for each commodity. And then also the same for the downstream companies, which are the ones in the lighter blue. So they are the companies that trade, manufacture, and sell those commodities. In many cases, the right to free, prior, and informed consent is reliant on the formal recognition of land managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities, but a very small percentage of land is formally recognized by governments. So these companies which are making commitments on FPIC, which as you can see is significantly more than are making commitments on land use conflict, also need to support these with strong commitments on land use, also need to support them with strong commitments on land use conflict. As you can see, palm oil companies are by far the most likely to set commitments on free, prior, and informed consent, regardless of whether they're growing or selling the palm oil. But when we look at other commodities, particularly beef and leather, what we see is that more downstream companies, so the traders, the manufacturers, and the retailers, are making commitments to ensure the free, prior, and informed consent, but the companies that are likely producing and processing those commodities aren't making equivalent commitments. So for instance, beef and leather, they are the two commodities driving the majority of tropical deforestation, and yet the majority aren't even committing to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another one of the indicators that companies are assessed on, as I mentioned earlier, is labour rights, whether they have committed to protect the workers in their operations and supply chains, rights to the freedom of association, and to be free from forced labour, child labour, and discrimination. What we see here is that for each commodity, more than half of the companies assessed have set a commitment to protect these rights. So we're seeing a lot more action on labour rights than for the other human rights issues we've just talked about. But as you can see, there's another divide between the companies that are producing and processing the commodities, being less likely to set labour rights commitments than their downstream counterparts. And again, this is most notably the case for beef and leather. But across the board, upstream companies need to be setting stronger policies on labour rights through their supply chains to match those downstream company commitments. Next slide, please. Thank you. And of course, commitments are a crucial first step that companies can take, but without implementation, those commitments are meaningless. And yet, even of those companies with commitments on labour rights, too many are failing to implement them through things like monitoring their suppliers or operations for compliance with that labour rights commitments. As you can see, a third of the companies in beef, leather, and timber supply chains had not committed to implement their commitments on labour rights. And with so few even setting those commitments in the first place, that lack of implementation is condemning. And now on to the final finding I wanted to talk to you about. If I could have the next slide, please. Beef and leather, as I mentioned, are the key drivers of tropical deforestation today. with forests and other vital ecosystems being cleared to ranch cattle. Companies in these supply chains have an enormous ability to halt deforestation in their supply chains, but also to halt the human rights abuses associated with them, including land conflict, threats and violence against forest, land, and human rights defenders, as we've been talking about today. But despite that, not one of the companies in beef and leather supply chains that had made a commitment to ensure the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities reported any evidence of the implementation of those commitments. It is clear that too many companies throughout the forest risk commodity supply chains, including those in beef and leather supply chains, are ignoring the human cost of deforestation, and that urgently needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you, all of you, for a very kind of sober reflection on the stark reality of inaction in the face of quite horrific human rights abuses. Look, there will be time for questions. We value kind of diverse views, opinions, backgrounds, experiences, because we really want an honest and open dialogue. So just use the Q&A function on Zoom. And just a reminder, you can choose what language you want to listen to this webinar in. So if you want to listen in Portuguese, you do have that option. In a sense, in the first part of this webinar, we've looked at the reality of the problems. Now we need to look at solutions. I'm going to ask each of you to be relatively concise, just so we can have some time for questions at the end. But Anna, if I could start with you, solutions. I mean, I've asked you to be concise. It's a huge question, but what needs to change? But what are the steps?
I'll be brief, I think, and I'm going to be speaking from the point of view of someone who is ahead of a foundation that supports human rights struggle and support grassroots groups. I think it's I mean, first step is to think of what Chai Surui said and Mauricio said. I mean, there are lots of initiatives going on in Brazil. Grassroots groups, indigenous organizations don't know their way and know what they need to do in order to stop what's going on, or to fight for the rights, for the protection of the rights and protection of the forest, but they need support. And I mean, what I mean by support is they need political support and they need financial support. It's extremely important to strengthen the ability of local organizations, local grassroots groups that are in the front to move forward with their own initiatives. They know, what is the best strategy, and they need, and we need to be partners with them, supporting what they want to do. It's the only way. I mean, together with other international initiatives that we may have, it's extremely important that we keep in mind that we need to support the local people, because they are the ones who know what to do.
Thank you, Anna. Louise, one of the solutions clearly has to be laws. It has to be legislation in countries, in places like the EU and the UK. Talk us through where we are.
Yeah, so I think legislation is a really important aspect of this, and we've seen the UK introduce a deforestation due diligence provision in the Environment Act last year, which requires companies to ensure they're not contributing to illegal deforestation in their supply chains, but it only applies to certain agricultural commodities. It's not going to explicitly cover the rights of those protecting their lands and forests. So, presently, for example, UK companies could still benefit from gold mining and what I've talked about earlier. We really think that there needs to be a very entwined and kind of comprehensive response by government to social and environmental issues in supply chains. And the Global Resource Initiative, which is the government's own task force looking at these issues, in 2020 said that human rights should be addressed alongside deforestation and land conversion, and a focus on forest and land conversion should be a first step. Wider impacts associated with commodity production and trade should also be addressed, and the lessons extended to other food commodities and beyond. And obviously we've heard from Forest 500 analysis that there are very few companies setting comprehensive commitments on human rights associated with deforestation, and they're not being properly implemented. So we do think that we need a stronger piece of legislation, and CAFOD and many other organisations in the UK are calling for a new Business, Human Rights and Environment Act, which would be based on the UK's Bribery Act. So it would apply to all businesses operating in the UK and require human rights and environmental due diligence in their supply chains and operations, no matter where they're operating. So this would mean that companies would have to trace their supply chains, understand their risks, take action to prevent and mitigate harm. It would include things like requiring free, prior and informed consent of communities and so on before business activities take place. And it would hold companies accountable if they failed to prevent harm. So it would reverse the burden of proof. In effect, it would ensure that the onus is on companies to make sure that they're not contributing to harm in their supply chains. And this is a model that works in the Bribery Act regarding corruption and similar issues. So it really needs to be, we think we need legislation to stop the defense for companies just say, oh, we didn't know about this, so it's not our fault, it wasn't something that we knew about. We don't think lack of information is an excuse, and we need to go beyond the kind of soft legislation we've got on transparency and reporting, and actually make it require action rather than just reporting. And this is legislation that's been found to be legally feasible. It's been recommended by parliamentarians. It's aligned with existing international standards on business and human rights. And there's also new legislation coming into place in Europe as well. The EU tabled similar legislation earlier this year. So it's something that's happening. We think the UK needs to step up now and take a kind of comprehensive approach to tackling deforestation, but also other global business impacts in supply chains as well.
Thank you. I mean, Emma, from your point of view, legislation is clearly really important. Louise has just pointed that out, but the thing about legislation is it takes time, and everything that we've heard today says we need action right now to help the people that Anna represents and Anna works with. So what should and can companies and also financial institutions, which you haven't really touched on, be doing now?
So yeah, as we've seen, companies are not doing enough to address these issues. And as you say, we need that to change now. In fact, just of the 350 companies that Forest 500 looks at, only one company had met all of the human rights indicators that we assessed them for, and they're only assessed for one commodity. So that's only one of 350 doing the things that we need them to do, and even then, just for one commodity. And what we've seen is that upstream companies, so those that are producing and processing forest risk commodities, are particularly lagging behind. So we need to see much more rapid improvement from those companies. They need to be setting and implementing strong commitments on human rights now. But then the downstream companies, so the traders, the manufacturers, the retailers, they also have a really crucial role to play in eliminating the issues from their supply chains. They have a huge ability to influence the upstream companies in their supply chains. And the traders, the manufacturers and retailers, they can't achieve the commitments that they're setting unless their producers and their processors also meet those requirements. So these downstream companies need to either start or strengthen their engagement with their suppliers on human rights abuses linked to deforestation. And that can also come with introducing incentives for their suppliers to implement those commitments, which could include a time-bound threat of exclusion from the supply chain if non-compliance continues. The power that these companies have through engagement is crucial, but as of now, many of them seem to be ignoring that power that they have. And what we've also seen is that relying on voluntary action alone is not enough. We've been doing Forest 500 assessments since 2014, and we just haven't seen enough progress. So as Louise said, we need that strong legislation for companies in forest risk supply chains and others to require them to identify and address these issues in both producer and consumer countries. But we also need financial institutions that are providing finance to those companies to step up and act now as well. We need to see financial institutions setting strong policies on human rights abuses, requiring companies to act on these issues if they are to continue receiving financing. And that will really put pressure on those companies from all angles.
Thank you. If you do have any questions that you want to put to our panelists, please do use the Q&A section on your Zoom screen. Emma, there's a question here from Louise, which is going to, not from panelist Louise, from another Louise, I'm assuming, unless Louise is trying to, give you tough questions. But it says, regarding the company commitments, what percentage of those are companies from Brazil? Now, I realize that puts you on the spot and you might not know off the top of your head, but you can point out how people can find that out.
Yes, I unfortunately do not know them off the top of my head, but on forest500.org, you can download all of the data from our website. So you can see how every company that we've assessed has scored, which you can then filter by the country in which they're headquartered or in which they operate. So you'll be able to find those statistics out for yourself. But if you have any issues doing that, then please do drop us an email at forest500@globalcanopy.org.
And one for you, Louise. I mean, I imagine the answer is a collection, but emissions linked to gold mining. Are emissions linked to gold mining due to deforestation, or are they linked to other activities? Do you know?
It's a combination. I mean, there's this mining technology which also causes emissions. I mean, what we're talking about is mostly the deforestation side, but yes, there are other aspects of mining activities that contribute to climate change as well.
Anna, if I can ask you, who do you think holds the power to make a difference in a country like Brazil? In a country like Brazil, where the current government isn't acting, who do you then need to see action from to change things on the ground?
Aaron, whether the government is, allowing us to do anything or not doing anything, a progressive government or not, I think the people in the field hold an enormous power and need, and that's why I said we need to support the people in the field and NGOs and all that. I truly believe that human rights do not advance, that democracy doesn't advance if we don't have a strong civil society. And by that, I mean NGOs and grassroots groups empowered and capable of doing the work of advocating for the rights. Brazil is a country where the legislation is really advanced. We have good environmental laws, good human rights laws. We've worked a long way through here. The problem is how to implement that, and also, and of course, currently we are living in hell, I would say. It's just not possible to think about that, and that's the reason why I think currently the only way of doing things and trying to change things, and the power rests exactly in the hands of the local people, of the civil society organized, that together with international partners are capable of resisting and maybe stopping some destruction. We are living in a time of resistance, not a time, unfortunately, of advancement in rights, but resistance is already something. And I think that's why I'm insisting on this. currently. Maybe, you know, next year, if we have a change in our political situation, we're going to be talking a little bit different, hopefully, but for now it is possible, and the local people and indigenous people are doing amazing work in resisting, and so they are the ones that we need to support.
Emma, a question that hopefully could be music to your ears, because it says, for financial institutions, do you have a best practice guide to increase your scoring, or what they could do? But there is specific guidance out there, isn't there, for financial institutions to change?
Yes, so we don't have kind of a best practice guide for Forest 500, but we do have a roadmap for the finance sector, which outlines how they can identify, address, and then eliminate deforestation and also associated human rights abuses from their portfolios, specifically looking at commodity-driven deforestation, and that has a 2025 target date. So I can put the link to that in the chat, and that specifically looks at free, prior, and informed consent, violence and threats against forest, land, and human rights defenders, labor rights, and also land use conflict and customary rights to land, resources, and territory.
There are a couple of questions here which I might just lump together. I don't know whether, Louise, you can have a go at answering them. One says, how can due diligence policies be most effectively monitored and enforced? And another says, what do you think about zero net deforestation commitments that some companies have taken? I mean, a number of companies made at COP and things like that, but it's about how do we, I suppose, avoid greenwashing? How do we check that companies are doing what they are saying they are going to do? How can we enforce that?
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Well, I think partly the proof is in, you know, action that's actually taken and what is happening on the ground. So in terms of monitoring and enforcement, I think it's important that we don't just look at the, you know, what companies say they're doing, the kind of enforcement of reporting legislation, which we've seen in terms of the Modern Slavery Act and the legislation, but we actually looking at what is happening on the ground, and are these policies that companies are putting into force actually making an impact? And that is one of the reasons why we're advocating for this new legislation, because it's more about the actions, and the companies will be held accountable. So the way of testing whether things are working is really whether the harm is happening and, you know, can be connected to that company. And there are various different ways in which governments can monitor and enforce that kind of legislation, through independent regulators, through the courts, companies. There's another question in the chat about the kind of enforcement about due diligence policies and tracing kind of beyond the first tier of suppliers as well. You know, there are many ways in which companies can do that and ensure that their supply chains actually less complex, develop longer term relationships with their suppliers. And we also need countries like Brazil to enforce the legislation in those countries, and to, you know, ensure that from that side that abuse isn't happening. In terms of the greenwashing, that's a major issue. We've had lots of companies at COP and in other forums, you know, express, you know, they're saying that they will do X, Y, and Z, and we know that the companies with big sort of PR teams, often the ones that are making these big commitments, but actually are also the ones that are often linked to harm. So it is a concern. I think we just have to, as civil society, we have to make sure that these companies are being monitored. We need stronger legislation. We need to make sure that what they're saying, they're actually doing in practice.
We have got a very limited amount of time left, so I might give you all sort of just 1 minute on a question that has come up. Anna, if I start with you. So Angie says, what's your advice for convincing companies to act in the current context of a cost of living crisis, when they may be more concerned over the affordability of products than sort of ethically sourced products. I suppose the question boils down to, what do you say to companies to convince them that they have to change and they have to act? Anna.
Ask you to start with Louise and Emma, and I'll just go last. Thank you.
Okay, Emma, you can go first.
Sure, I'll give it a go. I think there is a cost of living crisis, but if deforestation continues and stopping human rights abuses is a key part of halting deforestation, if that continues, then the climate crisis will continue to worsen, the biodiversity crisis will continue to worsen. All of these enormous systemic issues will be worsened, and the cost to companies to address those issues, to reduce those issues, will continue to grow, and so will the cost for consumers. So putting off that action at the moment will just shift that cost into the future, and also make that cost even worse potentially.
Thank you, Emma. Louise, do you have anything to add?
I think Emma pretty much answered that well. So yeah, I think that we need to look at this in a much more holistic way, and also there are many studies that have shown, for example, that the cost of doing effective due diligence in supply chains, the amount that's passed on to the consumer is actually quite minimal, and it's actually there's many benefits for businesses in terms of long-term sustainability of supply chains and for the business itself. So there are reasons why I think that we can still pursue the sustainability agenda at this time, despite that this this is very much a concern as well.
Thank you, Louise. Anna, you have about 30 seconds.
Sorry, problems with computer here. No, nothing to add, but just to, I guess, to reinforce what I said in my speech. I mean, this deforestation serves a project of land occupation and, dictated by powerful economic interests, and it's not serving the people. It's not serving the planet itself. So I think we need to think about that further, and to think about how many lives are being killed, how many people are being killed, how many things are being destroyed, the culture of people, the way of being of people in the forests, in order to serve deforestation and illegal extraction of minerals in the Amazon, and to balance that with what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish, just to see that we're not getting there. We need a change.
Anna, thank you very, very much for that. That's a really powerful place to end. Anna, thank you. Emma, thank you. Louise, thank you. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for your questions. Our briefing that we published today on this issue can be found on the Forest 500 website. Thank you all for your time. I hope it has made everybody think, and yeah, the slide there tells you where to go to get the sort of briefing documents and to sort of educate yourself further in this crucial issue. So thank you.